I had 6 of my father's babies, and he gave every single one of them up for adoption. He'd say it was God's will, whispering it in the dark of my room where the air was always thick and heavy with unspoken things. He told me that's all a big-boned girl like me was ever going to be good for. To be a quiet, sturdy place to hide his sins, and then to pass them on to strangers. My name is Zinnia Smith, and I've been on this earth for 81 years. If you were to ask anyone down here in Calico Rock about me, they'd likely smile and tell you about the old woman who lives at the end of Briar Patch Lane. They'd tell you about my zinnias, how they win a blue ribbon at the county fair most every summer, standing up so bright and proud. They'd say I'm quiet, but always have a scripture verse ready for a soul in need. I'm the woman who sits in the same oak pew at the back of the First Baptist Church every Sunday, the one who just nods and hums along with the hymns, lost in her own thoughts. That's the woman they see, a simple, harmless widow, tending to her flowers and waiting to meet her Lord. But this town, it's built on secrets. Calico Rock is a warm place, you see. The Arkansas sun bakes the pavement till you can see the heat shimmering right off it, and the nights are filled with the drone of locusts and the sweet, almost cloying smell of honeysuckle. It's the kind of warmth that feels good at first, but after a while, it just smothers you. It's a town of polite nods and covered dishes brought over when there's a death in the family. But underneath all that sweetness, there are truths that folks would rather let lie buried. Truths as tangled and deep as the roots of the 100-year-old cypress trees down by the creek. My truth was one of them. That sweet old woman with the flowers. She's just the last chapter of the book. And I reckon, after all this time, it's only right that you hear the rest of the story. It's a heavy thing to carry alone. So, I'm asking you, not just to listen, but to bear witness. To stand here with me in the shadows while I finally, after all these years, find the strength to strike a match. It ain't a pretty story, but it's mine, and it is demanding to be told. Before the silence set in, our little house on Briar Patch Lane was filled with the sound of my mother's humming. She'd hum old hymns while she was kneading bread dough, her hands dusted white with flour. The scent of yeast and cinnamon always seemed to hang in the air back then. On wash days, her hands smelled of lye soap and the lavender she grew in a small patch by the back door. She was a gentle, humming woman. My father, Jedadiah, he was a man of loud prayers and a firm hand, but back then his firmness felt like the trunk of a great oak tree, something you could lean on and know you were safe. I'd sit on the porch swing between 'em on hot summer evenings, my head resting on Mama's shoulder, my feet not quite touching the floorboards, listening to the crickets start their nightly choir. In those moments, I felt like the most protected girl in all of God's creation. Now, looking back through the fog of all these years, I can see the little cracks in the foundation that I couldn't see then. A child's eyes. They only see the sunshine, not the shadows it casts. My father's piety, for instance. In church, his amens were always the loudest, his voice booming over everyone else's like he was making sure God and the whole congregation heard him first. My mother's faith was a quiet conversation, a whisper in the garden. His was a performance, and the way he'd talk about me. Mama would say I had a gentle soul, that I had her kindness in my eyes. But Daddy, he'd clap me on the shoulder and say, "This one's a sturdy girl. Got good solid bones. Nothing gonna knock Zinnia down." At the time, I'd puff out my chest with pride. A sturdy girl, a solid girl. I didn't understand then that he wasn't seeing a daughter to protect. He was seeing a vessel built to endure. I remember one time, must have been late summer, 'cause the air was getting that crisp edge to it. He was mending a fence post out in the pasture, and the wood split on him. The sound of his cursing. It was low and violent, like a growl ripping from the belly of some wounded animal. I saw him take the hammer and smash what was left of that post into splinters, his whole body tight with a rage that was far too big for a broken piece of wood. Mama saw it too, from the kitchen window. She just walked out there, didn't say a word, and put her hand on his arm. He dropped the hammer like it had burned him. When he came inside for supper, he was quiet and calm, as if nothing had happened. Mama just gave me an extra spoonful of blackberry cobbler and started humming again, a little louder this time, as if to push back the memory of that sound. She was always smoothing things over, my mama, always standing between us and the parts of him that were sharp and broken. The last good memory I have is of her teaching me to quilt. Her fingers, though calloused from work, moved with such grace. Every scrap has a story, Zinnia, she told me, pointing to a piece of blue gingham. This was from your first Sunday dress, and this floral one, this was from my apron the day your daddy asked me to marry him. She was piecing together our lives, stitch by stitch. She held up my clumsy, crooked square next to her perfect one and said, "It don't matter if the lines are straight, honey. It matters that the pieces hold together." She was the thread that held us all together. And then the fever came. It started as a cough, and in what felt like just a few days, it stole the hum from her throat and the light from her eyes. The doctor came and went, his face grim. Neighbors brought broth and whispered prayers on our porch. I remember praying harder than I ever had, making all sorts of promises to God if he'd just let her stay. I prayed till my knees were sore and my throat was raw. I remember the scratch of the wool blanket she was under. Funny, I can't for the life of me recall the pattern on that quilt. Was it stars or squares? The mind holds on to the strangest things, the feeling of the scratch, but not the sight of the pattern. The day she passed, the whole world seemed to go quiet. The birds stopped singing. The sun felt cold. At the funeral, my father stood like a statue carved from stone. People came up and said, "She's with the Lord now, Jedadiah, and she was a fine woman." He just nodded. But that night, after everyone had gone and the house was filled with the smell of funeral lilies, I came downstairs for a glass of water. The door to his workshop in the barn was open, a slice of yellow light cutting through the dark. I peeked in. He wasn't crying. He wasn't praying. He was just sitting on a stool, staring down at his own two hands like he'd never seen them before. There was no grief in his face. It was a look of calculation, a cold, quiet assessment. Then he looked up and saw me standing there in my nightgown. He didn't call me over, didn't offer a word of comfort. His eyes, the same eyes that used to look at me with pride, scanned me from head to toe. And in that moment, I knew the man who was my father was gone. Someone else was looking out at me now, and the sturdiest walls in my world had just turned to dust. After Mama was buried, the silence in our house grew teeth. It wasn't a peaceful quiet anymore. It was a heavy, watching quiet. The humming was gone, and in its place was the sound of my father's heavy boots on the floorboards, each step a reminder that we were the only two people left. At first, I thought his coldness was just grief, wearing a different coat. I'd try to talk about Mama, to remember a story or a song, and he'd cut me off. "The past is the past, Zinnia," he'd say, his voice flat. "The Lord commands us to look forward. Dwelling on what's gone is a form of vanity." He started using the Bible like a weapon, picking out verses about obedience and a daughter's duty. He'd read them aloud at the dinner table, his eyes fixed on me, making God's holy words feel like a collar tightening round my neck. He began to chip away at my world, piece by piece. When the youth group from church planned a hayride, he told me I was still in mourning and it wouldn't be proper. When my friend Sarah came to the door to walk to school, he told her I wasn't feeling well. Soon, he had a new reason. "A girl of your size, Zinnia. You draw looks," he said one afternoon, his voice laced with a sort of false pity. "It ain't modest. People will talk. It's for your own protection that you stay close to home." He made my body, the body my mother had called strong and healthy, feel like a shameful secret I had to hide. My world, which used to be as wide as the Arkansas sky, shrank to the walls of that house and the yard that surrounded it. The first time he truly scared me, it wasn't with his hand, but with his stillness. I was tasked with polishing my mother's silver, what little of it there was. My hands were clumsy with sadness, and I dropped her silver locket, the one she always wore. It left a tiny, almost invisible dent. I tried to hide it, but he saw everything. He didn't yell. He just took the locket from my hand, his touch cold, and walked me to my room. He told me to sit on my bed. Then he went into my closet and took out the little wooden box where I kept my treasures. A collection of smooth river stones, a blue jay's feather, a dried wildflower Mama and I had pressed. He opened it, and one by one, he began to speak of each item. Vanity, he said, holding the feather. Worldly attachment, he said of the stones. He told me that my carelessness with my mother's locket proved I didn't deserve to hold on to my own frivolous things. He took the box and told me he was burning it to purify the house of my attachments. He was erasing me, erasing the parts of me that were still connected to her, to the girl I used to be. I sat there on that bed long after he'd gone, and I didn't cry. I just felt a hollowing out, like he'd reached inside and scooped out something essential. The real twist, the moment I understood this wasn't about grief, came a few weeks later. He'd sent me to the attic to fetch down some old blankets for the winter. Tucked away in a dusty corner was my mother's old cedar chest, or maybe it was pine. It had the sharp, clean smell of cedar. I remember that much. The scent of it is clearer in my mind now than the look of the wood itself. Inside, beneath her wedding dress, I found a small bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. They were from him, from before they were married. My hands trembled as I opened one. His handwriting was so different then, loopy and full of life. But it was the words that made the blood run cold in my veins. He wrote to her about his own father, a man he had always described to me as a gentle, God-fearing farmer who died too young. But in these letters, he told a different story. He wrote of a hard, bitter man who drank, who used the Bible to justify his rages, who would lock him in the barn for the smallest infractions. He described his own childhood of fear and silence. I sat there in the dusty attic light, the letter shaking in my hand. The man he was describing was the man he was becoming. No, it was the man he had been all along, hidden behind my mother's goodness. This wasn't grief changing him. This was a dark seed that had been planted in him long ago, and my mother's love had been the only thing keeping it from taking root. Now that she was gone, it was free to grow. I quickly folded that letter, tied the ribbon back around the bundle, and hid it right where I'd found it. That evening, my father patted my head after I served him his supper, a gesture that almost seemed tender. And a part of me, a desperate, childish part, clung to that. I told myself I must have read it wrong, that the devil was trying to poison my heart against my own poor, grieving father. I made myself believe it, because believing that lie was 1,000 times easier than facing the truth of who I was alone with in that house. For a little while, that lie was a shield. But a lie, I would soon learn, is a mighty poor shelter in a coming storm. My father began to build my prison with the good intentions of others. He used their pity like mortar and their Christian charity like bricks. My friend Sarah, who had a laugh like wind chimes, tried to visit a few more times. The last time she came, I saw her through the front window, her hand raised to knock. Before I could even move, my father was there, opening the door just a crack. I couldn't hear his words, but I could see the performance in his posture, the slumped shoulders, the weary shake of his head. I saw the bright hope in Sarah's face curdle into a look of concern, of pity, not for me, for him. She looked once toward my window, a confused, sad little wave, and then she walked away. She didn't come back after that. The church was next. It had been my sanctuary, the one place outside of home where I felt a connection to something bigger. My absence was noticed. Pastor Miller himself came to call. My father met him on the porch, and they spoke for a long time in low, serious tones. Later, my father told me the pastor was praying for me. I had to tell him, Zinnia, he said, his voice heavy with a false sorrow. I had to tell him about your troubles, your dark moods, your feelings of shame. He was painting a picture of me for the whole town, of a girl whose grief had broken something inside her mind. He was making me into a story, a cautionary tale. The devoted, heartbroken widower, Jedadiah Smith, tending to his poor, unwell daughter. Who would ever question such a man? Who would ever believe the ramblings of the girl he was so patiently caring for? The world, which had already shrunk to the edges of our property, began to close in until it was just the house itself. The windows weren't for looking out at life anymore. They were just squares of light that reminded me of a world I couldn't touch. The porch swing, where I had felt so safe with my mother, was now forbidden. "A girl with your afflictions needs quiet and shadow, not the public eye," he'd say. My days became a silent routine of chores, each one dictated by him. Scrub the floors, mend his shirts, prepare his meals. The only voice I heard was his, either reading scripture that condemned me or sighing with disappointment over some small mistake I'd made. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of his judgment. A desperate little bit of rebellion flickered in me one afternoon. I wrote a small note to Sarah on a scrap of brown paper from a grocery sack. It just said, "I'm okay. Please come." I planned to slip it into our mailbox at the end of the lane after he was asleep. But I was careless. I tucked it under my mattress, and he found it when he decided my room needed to be inspected for vanity. He didn't yell. Oh, that would have been a mercy. Instead, he brought the note to me in the kitchen, his face a mask of profound hurt. "Deceit," he whispered, the word like a snake in the quiet room. "Your mother was the most honest woman I ever knew. To see her daughter, her only child, acting with such a deceitful heart, it would have broken her." He held my sin up for me to see. But it was my love for my mother that he used as the knife, twisting it with precision. He made me feel like I had betrayed her memory, and the shame of it was a heavier chain than any lock and key. The final wall of my prison was cemented in place by a woman's kindness. Mrs. Gable, a dear soul from 2 houses down, who always smelled of cinnamon and kindness, came by with a pecan pie. It was a Tuesday, I think. I remember the sun was bright on her silver hair. I opened the door, and for a second, the smell of the world rushed in. Fresh cut grass, car exhaust, and her warm, sweet pie. My heart leaped with a painful, desperate hope. But then he was there, his large frame filling the doorway behind me, a hand resting on my shoulder that felt as heavy as a stone. "Why, Mrs. Gable, you are too kind," my father said, his voice dripping with that weary grace he had perfected. "The Lord bless you for thinking of us." She smiled, her eyes crinkling, and held the pie out. "Just wanted to check on young Zinnia. We miss seeing her pretty face." My father's hand squeezed my shoulder. "Ah," he sighed, a long, theatrical breath. "She has her good days and her bad days. Grief has left a deep mark on the child. Today is a quiet day. We mustn't overstimulate her." He gently took the pie, and with a sad smile, began to close the door. I saw the look in Mrs. Gable's eyes just before the door latched. It was pure Christian pity, and it was all for him. He hadn't just locked the doors of the house, he had locked every door on the outside too, using their sympathy as the key. He had turned me into a ghost in my own life story, a poor, troubled thing to be whispered about and prayed for from a safe distance. As I stood there in the dim hallway, the smell of that pie the only proof that the world outside was still real, I finally understood. I wasn't just alone, I was invisible, and nobody comes looking for a girl they can't even see. The war he waged on me was a quiet one. There was no yelling, no overt violence that a neighbor might hear through an open window. The abuse, when it began, was methodical. It was presented as a sad, holy duty that had fallen upon him. He'd come to my room late at night, after he'd sat for an hour reading his Bible in the living room. His breath would smell of coffee and a strange, sour righteousness. He'd use scripture, twisting the stories of families in the Old Testament, talking about bloodlines and purity and keeping our family safe from the sins of the outside world. He gave his ugliness a holy name, and in doing so, he tried to make me a party to it, an accomplice. In those first months, I fought, I pleaded, I cried. I prayed to the same God he used as a shield, begging for a sign, for deliverance, for the floor to open up and swallow me whole. But my tears only seemed to harden his resolve. He called my struggling a test of my faith, my pleas the sound of the devil trying to tempt a righteous man from his path. So I learned a new way to survive. I learned to go away in my own mind. While he was in my room, I'd go back to the porch swing with my mother. I'd listen for her humming above the sound of the creaking floorboards. I'd smell the lavender from her garden. I let my body become just a room in the house he had a key to, while my soul, my real self, hid in the attic of my memory with the ghosts of better days. My own face became a stranger to me. I'd catch a glimpse of myself in a window pane and see a hollowed-out girl with haunted eyes. My identity was being scraped away layer by layer. I wasn't Zinnia, the girl who loved the smell of rain and the taste of wild blackberries. I was just the girl in the house, a vessel, an object of his sad, twisted duty. My faith, which had been a sturdy oak, felt like a sapling in a hurricane. I'd lie in bed and whisper to the ceiling, "Lord, do you see this? Are you there?" And the silence from heaven felt just as heavy and as absolute as the silence in that house. Then, the silent war produced a casualty. My body, the one I had tried so hard to forget, began to betray me in a new way. It began to change. A sickness in the mornings, a thickness around my waist that the apron couldn't hide. A terror so profound it was a physical taste in my mouth like old pennies. I was carrying his secret, and it was growing inside of me. I thought, this is it. This is when the world will find out. When my shame will be laid bare for all of Calico Rock to see. I expected his rage, a final, terrible explosion. But the plot twist wasn't his anger. It was his satisfaction. He'd been watching me, I realized, with those cold, assessing eyes. One afternoon, as I was kneading dough, my movements sluggish and heavy, he came and stood beside me. He didn't look at my face. He looked at my waistline. And a slow, grim smile touched his lips. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said, his voice calm and steady. "He gives burdens, but he also provides the means to bear them." He looked me right in the eye then, and the full diabolical cleverness of his plan was laid bare. "All those years, I worried about your size, thought it was a curse. But I was a fool. It's a blessing, Zinnia. It's a cloak. The Lord provides a cloak for his secrets. The shame he had cultivated in me for years, my size, the thing he'd used to lock me away from the world. It was now the very thing he would use to hide his greatest sin in plain sight. I stopped fighting then. I stopped praying for help. What was the use? He was always one step ahead, even it seemed, one step ahead of God. My only prayer left was for my own soul to curl up into a tiny ball in some forgotten corner of my heart where he could never, ever find it. The life inside me grew, a secret hidden beneath the shame he had draped over me. It was a ticking clock in a silent house, and I had no idea what would happen when the alarm finally went off. I know this part of the story is hard to hear. It's a darkness that most folks would rather turn away from. But I need to know you're still there. I need to know you have the courage to see it through with me. Subscribe if you're willing to stay, because it's in the deepest darkness that you have to decide if you're going to let it swallow you whole or if you're going to start watching for a dawn you can't even yet imagine. The final weeks of carrying that first secret were a special kind of hell. The Arkansas summer had reached its peak, and the heat was a physical presence, a suffocating blanket that left no air to breathe. The house was an oven. My body, heavy and swollen, felt like a prison within a prison. Every kick and flutter from the life inside me was a terrifying reminder of what was to come. A baby was coming, a living, breathing creature that would be born into this silent horror. My father watched me, his expression unreadable. He had stopped his nightly duties weeks ago, now treating me with a kind of detached concern, like a farmer watching a prize sow before she gives birth. The care wasn't for me, it was for the product. Then, one morning, he announced he had to go to a church conference over in Mountain View. He'd be gone overnight. It was the first time he'd be leaving for more than a few hours since Mama died. He gave me a list of chores: canning the last of the green beans, mending a tear in his work coat, scrubbing the porch. He spoke as if it were any other day, his trust in my brokenness so complete that he didn't even feel the need to threaten me. As I watched his old truck rattle down the lane and disappear behind the trees, a feeling I thought was long dead sparked to life in my chest. It was hope. A wild, terrifying, beautiful hope. For hours I didn't move. I just listened, expecting to hear the truck return at any moment. But the only sounds were the buzzing of flies and the frantic beating of my own heart. He was gone. He was really gone. The plan exploded in my mind, fully formed. I wouldn't wait. I would save this baby. I would save myself. I went to the loose floorboard under my bed where I'd hidden $3 and a dime, money I'd saved from the rare occasions he'd sent me to the store. I wrapped a piece of cornbread in a dish rag. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely tie the knot. This was it. I was going to run. I waited until the sun had set, until the world was draped in the deep blue of twilight. Slipping out the back door felt like being born. The night air, cool on my skin, was the first truly clean breath I'd taken in what felt like a lifetime. I didn't run. My body was too heavy for that. I just walked as fast as I could, my eyes fixed on the dark line of the woods that separated our property from the rest of the world. My destination was the creek. If I could get across the creek, I could follow the old logging road to the next town. Freedom was the taste of mud and damp leaves, the sound of my own ragged breath. I finally reached the tree line by the creek, my lungs burning, my legs trembling. The water was running shallow, and I could see the other side, the bank of freedom, just a few steps away. I took a breath, ready to step into the water, and then a lantern flared to life, not 20 feet away. My blood turned to ice. He was sitting on a fallen log, the lantern light casting monstrous shadows on his face. He wasn't at a conference. He'd been waiting. He didn't look angry. He looked satisfied, a professor pleased with the results of an experiment. "I had to know, Zinnia," he said, his voice calm, almost gentle. It was 1,000 times more terrifying than a shout. "I had to be sure. The devil puts rebellious thoughts into the hearts of the weak. I had to know if you would listen to them. I had to give you the rope, to see if you would hang yourself with it." He had built this entire thing, the hope, the plan, the desperate, moonlit flight, as a test, a lesson. He had allowed me to feel the hope of freedom just so he could be the one to personally extinguish it. He wanted to prove that even my own will was just a toy in his hands. He stood up and took my arm, his grip firm but not violent. The walk back to the house was a funeral march for the last piece of my soul. He had not just broken my body, he had broken my hope, which was so much worse. He had proven that the cage wasn't just the house, it was the whole world, his world, and there was no corner of it where I could hide from him. He closed and bolted the back door, sealing me back inside the thick, suffocating darkness. The tiny, brave spark of hope inside me dissolved into ash. He had won. He had proven his point, and it was in that moment of absolute, soul-shattering surrender, as I stood there on the cold linoleum of the kitchen floor, that the first pain ripped through me, sharp and low and undeniable. My body, a vessel for his secrets, and now his cruel lessons, had decided it was time. The hidden thing I carried was demanding to be born. My punishment, it seemed, was only just beginning. The birth was a lonely, brutal affair on a sweat-soaked mattress in the same room where my life had been dismantled. My father was there, not as a father or a comfort, but as a grim-faced warden, overseeing a transaction. He brought me water and cloths, his movements efficient, his face betraying nothing. He was simply ensuring the safe delivery of his property. The pain was a red-hot storm, but the silence was worse. It was just me, him, and the rhythmic, agonizing work of my body. When the baby finally came, a boy, his first cry cut through the stillness of that house like a judgment from God. For a few precious moments, my father placed him in my arms. He was so small, so perfect. His tiny fingers curled around one of mine, a grip so strong for a creature so new. I looked into his face, trying to memorize every line, every feature. I remember the impossible softness of his cheek against mine, but for the life of me, I can't recall if he had any hair on his head. It's funny how memory holds on to a feeling, but lets a detail like that slip away like water. In the quiet of my heart, I gave him a name, Samuel. It means God has heard, and it felt like the only prayer I had left. It was a secret I would hold on to, a tiny act of rebellion. I was his mother, and I had named him. Then my father's arrogance gave me my first weapon. So sure of my defeat, so convinced that I was nothing more than a broken animal, he became careless. He left me there, weak and bleeding, and went to the telephone in the hallway. He didn't even bother to close the door all the way. He thought I was too lost in pain and exhaustion to listen, to understand. But I listened. Every word is burned into my memory. "Silas," he said, his voice low and businesslike, stripped of all emotion. "It's done." "A boy." There was a pause. "No trouble. It's a strong one." Another pause, and then the words that changed everything. "You know the arrangement. The place in Pine Bluff. Just like we discussed. Come get it. It." He called my son, my Samuel, and it. And the phrase, "just like we discussed," echoed in the silent room. This wasn't a panicked solution he'd just come up with. This was a plan. A cold, prearranged system for disposal. The realization didn't bring tears. I was far beyond tears. It brought a chilling clarity. This wasn't random chaos. This was a procedure, and procedures have patterns. My Uncle Silas arrived less than an hour later. I heard his old rattling pickup truck long before it pulled up to the house. He had the same cold, assessing eyes as my father, the same set to his jaw. He came into the room carrying an old wooden crate lined with a blanket. He didn't look at me. Not once. He might as well have been picking up a sack of feed. My father wrapped Samuel in another blanket and placed him in the crate. A son passed from one brother to another like a piece of mail. I didn't cry out. I didn't beg. The girl who had tried to run through the woods was gone. In her place was something else, something harder and more patient. I watched. I memorized the squeak of Silas's worn leather boots on the floorboards. I memorized the resigned final click of the front door. I lay there, listening to the sound of the truck's engine turning over, catching, and then slowly fading away down the lane until it was completely swallowed by the night. My father came back into the room. "Rest now, Zinnia," he said, his voice holding a tone of finality. "You've done your duty. It's over." He thought he was looking at an empty shell. And in many ways, he was right. I was broken into 1,000 pieces, but as I lay there in the ruins, I understood something new. A broken mirror can't show you a whole picture, but every little piece can still reflect the light. He thought the story was finished, but his carelessness, his monumental pride, had just handed me the first page of a brand new chapter. A secret chapter that I would spend years writing in the darkness, a story that he would never ever know had even begun. Time, in that house, didn't pass in days or weeks. It passed in cycles of dread. The horror became a ritual, a dark season that would come upon our house every year or two. After Samuel was taken, a part of me turned to stone. I became a quiet observer in my own life, a ghost cataloging the details of my own haunting. My freedom wasn't going to be built with maps and escape routes. It was going to be built with memory. I started to build the architecture of my case in the silent cathedral of my mind. I marked the seasons. The second baby, a girl I named Rose in my heart, was born in the spring, when the dogwoods were in bloom. The third, another girl, Clara, came in the dead of winter, during a bitter ice storm. With each one, the grim ballet was the same. My body would change, hidden beneath the loose dresses my father provided. The sickness, the waiting, the silent, lonely birth, and then the phone call. To Silas. The arrival of the rattling pickup truck. The brief, agonizing moment I was allowed to hold my child before they were placed in the wooden crate and carried away like cargo. I memorized the sound of Silas's truck engine, noting how it sputtered differently in the cold. I memorized the weary sigh my father would give after Silas left, a sigh not of sadness, but of relief, as if a difficult piece of business had been concluded. These details were my bricks. These memories were my mortar. I was building something he could not see. The change in me was subtle. The girl who pleaded was gone. The girl who ran was gone. In my place was a woman made of watchful silence. My father mistook this for complete submission. His arrogance grew. He started allowing me to sit on the porch again, confident I was a broken, empty vessel, a testament to his control. And that was his second mistake. It put me back in the line of sight of the outside world, if only for a moment. It put me in the path of Mrs. Gable. She came by one afternoon in late summer, carrying a basket of late-season tomatoes, her face kind as always. My father stood behind my chair on the porch, his presence a heavy weight. He was performing his role as my patient keeper. Mrs. Gable smiled at me. "It's good to see you getting some air, Zinnia dear." This was my chance. I knew I couldn't scream or confess. He had built the walls of my madness too high in this town's mind. So I had to use the language he'd taught me, the language of faith and politeness. I looked past her to where her own grandchildren were playing in her yard. "I pray for your family every night, Mrs. Gable," I said, my voice quiet but clear. "It must be a true blessing from the Lord to watch your little ones grow." I felt my father's hand twitch on the back of my chair. Mrs. Gable's smile faltered. She had heard his stories. My words didn't fit the narrative of a simple-minded, troubled girl. They were too pointed. I saw the confusion in her eyes, the flicker of discomfort. "Oh, well, thank you, dear," she said, her kindness now mixed with caution as she glanced at my father. "We are all blessed in our own ways." She was hesitating. She was retreating back to the safety of the story everyone knew. I knew I had only a second more. I had to push past her fear. I leaned forward slightly, forcing her to look me right in the eye, letting her see past the placid mask I wore. I let her see the abyss. "God gave me blessings too, ma'am," I whispered, the words costing me everything. "He gave them to me right here in this house. But I'm not allowed to watch them grow." I held her gaze. "When you say your prayers, would you pray for the children a mother can't see? Pray for the ones who are lost." It was not an accusation. It was a prayer request, but it landed with the force of a thrown stone. The color drained from Mrs. Gable's face. In that moment, she wasn't looking at poor, troubled Zinnia. She was looking at a prisoner sending a message in the only code she had. The story my father had so carefully constructed crumbled in her eyes, replaced by a dawning, unspeakable horror. She stammered her goodbyes and practically fled, leaving the basket of tomatoes on the porch steps. She never looked at my father. The moment the door closed, he spun my chair around to face him. His face was a thundercloud, his calm facade gone. "What did you say to her?" he hissed, his fingers digging into the flesh of my arm. "I told you to be quiet. I told you not to speak." I didn't flinch. For the first time, I looked at him not as a daughter, not as a victim, but as an adversary. His eyes weren't looking at a broken object anymore. They were looking at a person who had found her voice, even if it was just a whisper. I had managed to pass a note through the prison walls, but from the cold fury in his eyes, I knew my punishment for it would be severe. The real question was, would the seed of doubt I'd planted in Mrs. Gable's mind take root and grow before he decided to bury me for good? The price for my whispered rebellion was swift and severe. My father's fury wasn't fiery. It was cold, like the ice storms that sometimes coated the trees in winter, beautiful and deadly. The porch became a lost country I was no longer allowed to visit. He nailed a board over the window in the parlor that faced Mrs. Gable's house, telling me the afternoon sun was too bright and hurt my delicate eyes. He was sealing me in, bricking up my world one piece at a time. The psychological torment intensified. Every evening, he would make me read aloud from the book of Proverbs, his finger pointing to the verses about a deceitful tongue and the ruin that comes to women who gossip. He made me speak my own condemnation, forcing the words of my shame out of my own mouth. During this time, the dark ritual began again. The fourth time, my body was used as a vessel, a hiding place. A fourth secret life began to grow inside me. But this time, his nightly visits were different. They weren't just a grim duty anymore. They were a reassertion of ownership, a brutal reminder that I belonged to him, that my words, my thoughts, my very body were his to command and control. He was punishing me for that single moment of connection with Mrs. Gable, and he would continue to punish me for 9 long months. But I had lit a fire, and even I didn't know the way it had begun to spread. Mrs. Gable, God bless her kind and troubled heart, did not forget my words. She didn't run to the sheriff or confront my father. She was too wise, too enmeshed in the ways of a small town to do that. Instead, she began to watch. I'd catch glimpses of her through the kitchen window, a brief shadow by her fence, a lingering figure at her own window. She was looking for a sign, for proof, for anything that would make sense of the horrifying plea she'd heard in my voice. She was trying to be my ally from afar. My father, now coiled with paranoia, noticed her watching. He saw a threat where there was only concern, and so he did what he did best. He began a campaign, a quiet, vicious war of whispers. I heard him on the phone with Pastor Miller, his voice dripping with feigned sadness. "I'm so worried about dear Mrs. Gable," he sighed. "She seems confused lately, staring at our house for hours on end. I fear her mind might be starting to wander." I saw the results a week later, when he insisted I accompany him to the general store. I saw how people looked at her. Mrs. Gable, once a beloved town elder, was now regarded with pity and a new, subtle distance. My father had taken her goodness and her concern and twisted them into weapons against her. He was isolating her, just as he had isolated me. The plot twist was not that he was cruel. I already knew that. It was that my first act of fighting back, my one desperate attempt to build a bridge, had led to the suffering of the one person who had tried to cross it. The weight of that guilt was crushing. I had pulled this innocent woman into the wreckage of my life. My freedom, it seemed, could only be bought with the currency of someone else's pain. Was it worth it? The question haunted my waking hours and my dreamless, exhausted sleep. I saw her in the town square that day, sitting alone on a bench she used to share with friends. She looked smaller, her shoulders slumped, the bright light in her eyes dimmed by the poison of my father's lies. Everything in me wanted to run to her, to confess, to take it all back, to promise to be silent forever if it would just restore her peace. I could end her suffering by simply retreating, by becoming the broken, quiet girl my father wanted me to be. But as I stood there, watching her, with my father beside me pretending to read the notices on the community board, a different feeling rose up through the guilt. It was a cold, hard anger. This was his true power. He made you feel ashamed, not just of yourself, but of the damage you caused to others. He made you believe that silence was the only way to keep the people you cared about safe. And in that moment, I knew that surrendering now would be the ultimate betrayal, not just of myself, but of Mrs. Gable too. Being quiet wouldn't protect her. It would only prove my father right. It would prove he had the power to silence anyone who questioned him. I didn't know how I was going to do it. I had no plan, no allies, and a fourth child growing inside of me. But I knew one thing for certain. Protecting Mrs. Gable and myself didn't mean being quiet anymore. It meant I had to find a way to get louder. After the birth of my fourth child, a boy I secretly named Daniel, a strange and unsettling calm descended upon our house. My father, having punished me for my whispers to Mrs. Gable and having seen the town turn on her, seemed satisfied. He believed he had won. He mistook my hardened silence for renewed submission, and in his arrogance, his vigilance relaxed. The storm of his paranoia receded, leaving behind the quiet, orderly tyranny I knew so well. This calm was his final, fatal mistake. It gave me the space I needed to search for the truth. My plan was no longer to escape my prison, it was to find a key. I knew a man like my father, so methodical, so proud of his control, would have a record, a testament to his sins that he would see as a testament to his power. I began to search, my heart hammered in my chest during those stolen moments when he was out in the barn or the fields. I'd rifle through his desk drawers, my fingers flying over papers, always listening for the sound of his returning footsteps. I'd check behind books on the shelves, in old coat pockets. I found nothing, but with each failed attempt, a cold resolve settled deeper into my bones. I was no longer a frightened girl. I was a hunter, stalking the truth in the quiet corridors of my own home. The night before the storm broke, he tried one last time to poison me with a lie. I was standing in the hallway, looking at the only photograph we still had of my mother, a small, faded image of her smiling in the garden. He came and stood beside me, not with his usual threatening presence, but with a quietness that was far more unnerving. She loved those zinnias, he said, his voice soft, almost wistful. I hadn't heard that tone from him in years. Everything I've done, Zinnia, he continued, looking from the photo to me, his eyes filled with a terrible, false sincerity. It's all been to honor her, to protect what we had. This world out there, it's a wicked, filthy place. It would have stained you, stained her memory. I've kept you safe here. I know it has been a hard path, a heavy burden for us both. But my love for you and for her, it demanded I do whatever it took to keep our family pure. It was the most venomous thing he had ever said. He was trying to name his evil love, to make me a willing partner in my own destruction by painting my prison as a sanctuary. For a single, terrifying second, the lie was so powerful, so gentle, that it almost worked. The little girl still buried deep inside me wanted to believe him. She wanted a father who loved her, no matter how twisted that love was. But then I looked at his eyes, and I saw nothing but the reflection of his own self-righteous pride. The moment passed. The little girl was gone for good. I didn't argue. I just gave a small nod. I understand that's what you believe, Daddy, I said, my voice empty of emotion. The ambiguity of it satisfied him, and he patted my shoulder before heading off to bed, confident in his power. That final poisonous lie was the key. It severed the last microscopic thread of him that I might have clung to. The next morning, he went to town for supplies. I didn't search in a panic. I moved with a calm, certain purpose. I knew where it had to be. In his bedroom closet, a place I had always been too afraid to truly search, under a loose floorboard beneath an old pair of his work boots, a place he thought was his secret alone. I pried the board up with my fingertips. And there it was. Not a collection of letters or a diary, but a small, heavy metal box meant for keeping cash. My heart didn't race. It settled. I reached in, my fingers brushing against the cold, smooth surface. It didn't rattle when I lifted it. It felt solid, final. I knew, with a certainty that was as real as the floorboards beneath my knees, that this box held the truth. It was the weapon, the key, the end. Just as I clutched it to my chest, its coldness seeping through my dress, I heard the familiar rattle of his truck coming up the lane, far earlier than I had expected. I heard the engine cut, the truck door slam, and his heavy footsteps on the porch. There was no time to hide it, no time to put it back. The storm was no longer coming. It was here. He filled the doorway of the bedroom, his shadow falling over me like a final judgment. For a long second, we were frozen. Me on the floor, clutching the cold metal box to my chest. Him standing there, his face slowly comprehending the scene. He saw the pried-up floorboard, the secret place he thought was his alone, and he saw the forbidden object in my hands. The mask of the pious, patient father didn't just crack. It shattered into 1,000 pieces, and for the first time in decades, I saw the true face of the beast beneath. It was pure, undiluted rage. "Give me that!" he snarled, the voice no longer the one he used for scripture, but the low, violent growl I remembered from the day he'd smashed the fence post. He lunged for the box, his fingers like claws. And something inside me, something that had been dormant for a lifetime, broke free. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it was solid. It was a stone wall against which his fury crashed. I held onto the box with a strength I didn't know I possessed. It wasn't the strength of my arms. It was the strength of 6 stolen lives, 6 secret heartbreaks, 6 children I had never been allowed to mourn. He was stronger than me, but he was trying to protect a lie. I was fighting for the truth. We wrestled there on the floor, a desperate, silent battle. His hands gripped mine, trying to wrench the box free, his breath coming in ragged bursts. In the struggle, the box fell from our grasp, hitting the wooden floor with a dull thud. The rusty latch, weakened by age, snapped. The lid sprang open. It wasn't money or deeds that spilled out. It was a single, thick, leather-bound notebook. I scrambled for it, my fingers closing around the worn cover just as he lunged again. I pulled it to my chest and opened it. The pages were filled with his neat, precise, chillingly clear handwriting. It wasn't a diary. It wasn't a confession. It was a ledger, an accounting of his sins. My breath caught in my throat. There were 6 entries. Each started with a date. Beside each date was an initial, SRCD, and 2 more I didn't even have names for. And next to each initial, a location. The words swam before my eyes, cold, hard, and undeniable. Orphanage of St. Jude, Hopewell Adoption Agency, Pine Bluff Children's Home. Samuel, I whispered, my voice trembling as I read the first entry. Rose. My voice grew stronger, fueled by a righteous fury that burned away all my fear. Clara. Daniel. I looked up at him, my vision blurring with tears I refused to let fall. You wrote them down. You wrote them down like livestock. Hearing his secrets spoken aloud in that room, seeing the proof of his systematic evil in my hands, broke the last tether of his control. A terrible, inhuman sound ripped from his throat. He raised his hand to strike me, his face turning a dark, mottled purple. This was it, the final, violent act. But the blow never landed. In mid-motion, his body spasmed. His eyes widened in shock, not at me, but at some terrible internal betrayal. He stumbled backward, his hand clutching at his chest, a look of disbelief on his face. He fell heavily, his head hitting the floor with a sickening crack. He lay there, gasping like a fish pulled from the water, his rage replaced by a helpless, sputtering fear. The hand that had been raised to silence me forever now twitched uselessly on the floorboards. The phone was in the hallway. Dr. Miller's office was only 10 minutes away. The part of me that had been raised to be a good, obedient daughter screamed at me to run, to call for help, to save my father's life. But I did not move. I stood there, clutching the leather notebook so tightly my knuckles were white, and I watched the architect of my long, silent war be finally, irrevocably silenced by the rebellion of his own wicked heart. I watched the life fade from his eyes, and in the ringing silence of that room, with the ledger of my lost children in my hand, I thought this was the end. I thought that in his death I had finally found my freedom. I thought the story was over, but I would soon learn it was only the end of the first war. A much longer, harder journey was about to begin. After my father's heart gave out on the floor of his bedroom, the world didn't change. The sun rose just as it always did. I called the sheriff and told him my father had passed in the night. The doctor called it a massive stroke. At the funeral, people said all the things you'd expect. They called him a good man, a pillar of the community, a devoted father who had borne a heavy cross with grace. They'd pat my hand and tell me he was with the Lord now, finally at peace. I just nodded, the leather-bound ledger feeling like a warm, living thing tucked away safely in my purse. The first person I told was Mrs. Gable. I walked to her house, the book in my hands, and I sat in her kitchen and laid the whole, ugly truth out on her table. We cried together. Her tears were for the child who had suffered next door. Mine were the tears I'd never been allowed to shed for my babies. In her belief, my own story finally felt real. In her witness, the ghost my father had created finally became a person again. I spent the next few months cleaning the house. I wasn't just scrubbing floors and washing walls. I was performing an exorcism, washing away the residue of his presence, his silence, his sin. I threw out his severe, dark furniture. I tore down the board he'd nailed over the window. I let the light in. The house became mine, and the ledger, his cold accounting of my pain, became my sacred map. The search took years. It took every penny he left me. It was a long, winding road of dead ends, sealed records, and bureaucratic indifference. But the woman my father had tried to erase refused to disappear. I found Samuel first. He was a carpenter in a town 3 counties over, with kind eyes and calloused hands. Meeting him, a grown man with a family of his own, was the most terrifying and beautiful moment of my life. I told him the truth of his beginning, not to bring him pain, but to give him the piece of his story that had been stolen. Then came Rose, a schoolteacher in Missouri, and Clara, a nurse in Little Rock, and finally my Daniel, who had his grandfather's sturdy build, but none of his coldness. 2 are still out there somewhere, 2 of my secret blessings. But I haven't stopped looking. I never will. They didn't come from shame. They came from my survival. And now they are the living proof that a life, no matter how trampled, can always find a way to bloom again. I thought that was the end of the story. I thought all the secrets had been unearthed, but there was one left. Just last year, I was finally cleaning out the last of the clutter from the barn, the old workshop where he'd sat staring at his hands all those years ago. In a dusty corner, tucked behind a stack of old feed sacks, was a small, rotting wooden box. Not his. The craftsmanship was rougher. I pried it open, and my breath caught in my throat. Inside were 6 little bundles wrapped in scraps of old oilcloth. My hands trembled as I unwrapped the first one. Inside was a single, tiny, hand-knitted baby booty. The next held a small, smooth river stone. The third, a single, perfect blue jay feather. Each bundle was marked with a crudely carved initial. SRCD. It was from Silas, my Uncle Silas, the silent man with the cold eyes who had been the instrument of my deepest pain. On each trip, after he had taken my child from my arms, he had kept a small, secret memento. He couldn't defy his brother, he couldn't save the babies, but he could remember them. He could perform this one small, hidden act of witness. It didn't excuse him, God knows it didn't. But it meant that in all those years, I hadn't been the only one holding on to the truth in the darkness. Another soul had been quietly counting, quietly acknowledging the humanity of each child. That is how a life that was meant to be buried in secrets found a way to bloom in the full light of day. I am not the story of a fat girl who was only good for one thing. I am the story of a mother who found her children. I am the story of a woman who learned that faith isn't about the absence of darkness, but about finding the strength to strike a match in it. If my story has touched you, I ask you to look for the light in the cracks of your own life. Speak your truth if you are able, or just bear witness for someone else who cannot. Every voice, every story matters. I'm still here, and I want to know what you think. Tell me, what city are you watching this from? I'd love to know just how far one old woman's words can travel. And please, subscribe to this channel so more stories can find their way out of the darkness and into the light.